The Teraflex 2.5-inch lift kit without shocks is for anyone with a two-door 2007 to 2018 JK that's looking for a lift to allow them to run a bigger tire on your Jeep. You are going to be able to run a 35-inch tire with this lift kit installed. If you don't have the factory plastic air dam in place, a 37 is definitely not going to fit with 2.5 inches of lift, especially if you have Ruby rails installed on your Jeep. And if you wanted to step down to a set of 33-inch tires with this lift kit, you're going to have plenty of room for articulation. And it's also going to be a pretty straightforward and fairly easy installation at 2 out of 3 wrenches. There's a good bit of disassembly of the Jeep to do in order to get it installed, but no drilling, no cutting, nothing major. And if you have some hand tools and a jack and jack stands, you can do this in your driveway, and we're going to show you how to get it done in just a second. So when you're looking at lift kits, you're going to find ones that are sort of all over the spectrum when it comes to pricing, and usually that will equate to how complete the kit is, whether it has things like brake line extensions, track bar brackets, sway bar end links, those major components that you're going to need and want with your lift kit. And this one from Teraflex is going to include all of that. Of course, this kit does not include a new longer set of shocks, which is something you're going to want to install when installing a 2.5-inch lift kit, either a shock extension or a new longer shock. The reason this kit does not include it is because they want you to have the flexibility to include whatever shock in your build you want to be running. If you do like Teraflex offerings, there are a couple of 2.5-inch lift kits from them that do come with their shocks, so you have that option as well. So let's talk about some of the components that are going to come in this kit. You're going to have new longer coil springs all the way around. That's what's going to provide you with your 2.5 inches of lift. You're also going to get some bump stop extensions for both the front and the rear of the Jeep. And the bump stops are really important because they do a couple of things. One, they're going to limit up travel of the suspension so that a tire isn't going to end up into your fender. It's also going to keep your shock from fully compressing, which can damage the shock. So again, that's important, not included in all kits, is included in this kit. You're going to get a new set of longer rear sway bar end links with this suspension kit. So the rear sway bar angle is going to be back closer to a factory angle with those longer end links. Up front, you don't need a new set of longer ones, so they're not included here. If you wanted to add them or add a set of disconnects, again, Teraflex has some offerings, and we also have some offerings from some other manufacturers as well. Along with the springs, the new longer sway bar end links, and the bump stop extensions, you're going to have some other things like brake line extensions for the back of the Jeep. Now, the brake lines, of course, very, very important. When you have a new, taller suspension, you're doing some articulating off-road, you want to make sure you're not going to pull one of those lines taut, possibly rupture a brake line. Of course, that's very bad. So you're going to have some longer brake line extensions in the back. Just going to move the mounting points down, giving you a little bit of additional room there. In the back, you're also going to have a track bar bracket, and Teraflex offers 2 different track bar brackets with their lift kits. This particular one comes with the better track bar bracket in pretty much every way. This track bar bracket attaches to the axle in a total of 3 different locations, making it a very strong point, because as you raise where the track bar connects to the axle, there's a lot of leverage there, and you certainly don't want that moving around. It can feel like the back end of the Jeep is swaying when you're driving down the highway, and again, that's not something you want to experience. So track bar bracket that's included here is very, very solid, and it has 2 different mounting points for the track bar itself. So depending on where you mount that, it'll change the angle of the track bar, thereby changing the roll center of the Jeep, and you can really dial in how the Jeep rides, how it handles, or because this is the 2.5-inch lift kit, just put it on that lower hole if you don't want to have to think too much about it and you're not really worried about dialing it in. Along with all the components that I just talked about, the kit of course includes all the hardware necessary to get them installed. So it is a very complete kit, and Teraflex does a really nice job engineering all of their stuff for your Jeep in particular. So this is a 2-door 2007 to 2018. The springs in this kit are going to be different than the ones for a 4-door because again, it's all dialed in for that 2-door, for the weight of the vehicle, to make sure it's going to handle really well on the road, ride really well on the road, but also handle and perform really well off-road. So these are really well put together kits. Because you are getting a kit that is a more premium option on the market, it is going to be a little bit more expensive than some of the other ones. You can find other 2.5-inch lift kits that don't include shocks that are going to be less expensive than this one is. But if you're looking for something quality, something that's going to ride really well, and something that's going to be very, very complete, I would recommend this one, even at the slightly higher price than some of the other options out there, right around that $550 mark. So as I mentioned before, this is going to be 2 out of 3 wrenches for the installation. I'm going to show you how to get that install done right now. For this installation, we used a variety of sockets and wrenches from 7/16 to 3/4 standard and from 18mm to 21 metric. We drove those with a variety of socket drivers as well as a variety of impacts, both electric and pneumatic. You're also going to need a razor knife, a marker that will mark on black rubber, a trim removal tool. We used a large mallet and also a pry bar, along with a drift to help us get some bolt holes lined up, and a long screwdriver for prying. To get started with our 2 out of 3 wrench installation, we have the Jeep up in the air here, but if you're doing this in your driveway, you could simply support the Jeep by the frame on some jack stands, but you do want to get it up in the air just a little bit, because what we're going to be doing is removing everything that keeps that axle from sagging down in order to get the axle low enough to get the factory springs out. So as you can see, ours is up in the air. We're going to put some pole jacks underneath the axle to support the weight and then start removing and loosening things to lower that axle down. So first things first, we'll get the pole jacks in place. With the weight of the axle supported, we're going to remove the sway bar end link from the axle side. With this lift kit, we're not going to be changing out the front sway bar end links, so just removing them from the axle side, keeping the hardware with the end link, and once we have both sides done, pushing the sway bar up out of the way is going to be more than enough for this install. So grab a couple of 18mm wrenches and get to it. And like I said, we're just going to put the factory hardware right back in here to store it so we don't misplace it, and we'll bolt this back up after the new springs are installed. We'll jump over to the other side and do the same thing. The next thing we're going to be doing is removing our track bar bolt. And while this is not a captured nut on the back side, it is a flag nut, so we don't have to hold it with anything. You will have to catch it though, because we're gonna have to hang on to that. We're gonna be reusing it. This is a large 21mm socket, and you may need a large breaker bar or a 1/2-inch impact to get that loose, because it usually has quite a few foot-pounds of torque on it. Just like the sway bar end links, we're going to put the hardware back into the track bar just as a spot to keep it. That way we don't misplace anything, and that's just going to be going right back in there after we get our spring swapped out anyway. The next thing we're going to remove are the lower shock bolts up front here. And again, this is just something we have to remove in order to get the axle to droop down and get the spring swapped out, but they're going to be going right back in again. So again, we have our 18mm wrenches. We'll remove those bolts. Just like everything else so far, we're just gonna pop that back in for safekeeping. While we're in this area, we're also going to remove this small 10mm bolt, and that just holds this brake line bracket to the bottom spring perch. This isn't absolutely necessary, but it does give us a little bit more room to droop that axle down without pulling tight on either of these brake lines, so we'll remove that bolt. Once the bolt's out of the way, as you can see, it frees up this brake line bracket. So now we have a little bit more room. We'll jump over to the other side and do the other lower shock bolt and the other brake line bracket. At this point, we're ready to lower down the axle and pull out the factory springs. The next thing we're going to do is install our bump stop extensions before we put our new longer springs in place. And all that consists of is pulling our factory bump stops out of the bump stop tube, putting our extension in and popping the foam bump stop back into the bottom of this. Now, that sometimes can be easier said than done. This is a pretty stiff rubber, and this has some detents in the bottom of that bump stop tube that can make it a little bit tough to get it pushed up in there. So you can try lubricating it, you can try using leverage, or something that I've resorted to a few times is marking the top of your bump stop extension here and using a really sharp razor knife to just carve away a little bit of material. It makes it a little bit easier to get it up in there, and then you can just give it a little bit of a turn to make sure that it locks in place and doesn't move on you. So we'll see what it takes to get ours into place, and we'll show you a couple of those different ways of doing it. So these can be a little bit tough to get out as well. We ended up using a large screwdriver. You can pry it up between the bump stop cup and the bump stop itself and use it to help pry the bump stop out of the cup. Once you have it out, we'll clean it up, lubricate it so it's ready to go in our bump stop extension once we get the extension installed. So no luck just trying to press this up into place with a little bit of lubrication on it. And whether that works or not for you will depend on how far these tabs are bent. Ours are just bent pretty far in, and they're very difficult to try and bend further out. So what we're going to do is hold our extension up to where we like it. We can either put a couple of marks on here or just mentally note where we need to carve out. And with a sharp razor knife, we'll just carve a little bit out of this upper lip, just a little bit, just to clearance that. Then we'll be able to set this up in place, give it a little bit of turn, and it'll be locked in. So with the extension where it's going to sit, we'll just put a couple of marks on it where those tabs are. So then when we head over to the table with a sharp razor knife, we know where to carve. So as you can see, we marked down there, but this lip is actually what we're going to take the material out of. And we just need to shave a little bit off. And like with any other sort of cutting, you can't put it back, so we'll just take a little bit off. We'll go test fit it. If it works, great. If not, we can always come back and remove a little bit more. We'll give that a go, see if it works. Once we have it seated all the way up, we're just going to give it a little bit of a turn to make sure it locks in. And there we go. All that's left is to slide the factory bump stop back into the bottom of the extension. Just like with everything else, we'll use a little bit of lubrication on here just to make it a little bit easier for us. Once it's lubed up, just giving it a little bit of a turn as we push it. Should seat it up in there. And there we go. We're gonna do the same thing on the other side, and then we'll get the springs put in. So after trying to fit our springs in, it looks like our axle isn't quite low enough, and the limiting factor is our drive shaft. We knew this might be an issue, but sometimes with a 2.5-inch lift spring, you can still get it in there. Again, we weren't able to this time, so all we need to do is take a 15mm socket, remove the bolts where the drive shaft attaches to the pinion. That will allow us to drop the axle far enough to get that spring in nice and easy. So these are the bolts we're going to be removing. Before we do that, we're just going to put a mark on the drive shaft and on the flange. That way we make sure everything lines up the same way when we put it back together. Now we can take out those 15mm bolts. With the drive shaft disconnected from the pinion, we can lower the axle back down again, and we should have plenty of room to get those new taller springs installed. At this point, we're ready to slide the Teraflex spring into place. First, we'll slide it over our new extended bump stop, and then we'll get the bottom seated on the bottom spring perch. Once you have the spring in place, you can rotate it so that the tail of the spring sits in the pocket of the lower spring perch. Now we can jump over to the other side and get the other spring installed. Now we have the luxury of being on a lift here. We disconnected the drive shaft and we have a ton of droop in the front axle in order to get our springs into place. If you don't have quite that much droop, if you're working on the ground and you just can't get the Jeep high enough to let the axle sag this much, what you can do is remove your bump stop extension here, set it to the inside of the spring. That'll make it easier to get the spring in place. Then you just have to wrestle your bump stop extension up into the bump stop tube. Now that can also be a little bit difficult. At least you have a few more things to pry against should you need to. On this side, on the driver's side of the Jeep, it's a little bit easier to get the spring in place because you don't have the drag link in the way. Over on the passenger side, if you do have a little bit of a fight, you can try that method. With both of our new longer springs installed, we can raise the axle back up and bolt everything back on. Once we have the axle to the appropriate height, we'll get those bottom shock bolts in first. So as you can see, we got our axle up high enough that it's lined up with the bottom of the shock. So we'll just get our nut and factory bolt out of the way, and we can get it pressed back in there. And we'll get the nut back on the bolt. Gonna go over to the other side and get the other one set up, and then we can come back and tighten these down. While we're over here, we'll get our brake line bracket seated back in place and get that tightened up, and then we'll tighten up our shock bolt. We'll jump over to the passenger side and do the same thing. Just use the small pry bar to help us get this seated back in place underneath the lower spring perch. And replace the factory hardware. Now we'll tighten up that shock bolt. So we'll do the same thing over here on this side, getting our brake line bracket bolted back up and tightening up our shock. Now we can bolt our drive shaft back into place. The next thing we're going to do is bolt up our sway bar end links. The last thing to button up on the front of the Jeep before we jump to the rear is getting our track bar bolted back up. And there are a variety of different ways to do this, from ratchet strapping it to just pulling on it and pushing on it and all sorts of different things to get this lined up properly. But the easiest way I've found is to put the tires on the Jeep, have the Jeep sitting under its own weight, and have a friend sit in the driver's seat and turn the steering wheel back and forth. That, because of the way the drag link is and the whole steering geometry of the Jeep, will shift the body over the axle, allowing you to very easily line up that bolt without the need for any pry bars or any ratchet straps at all. So essentially what we've simulated is that same thing here. We have the pull jacks underneath the axle, holding a little bit of the weight of the axle. We have Meredith sitting up in the driver's seat, so I'm going to get the factory bolt out of the track bar here, have her turn back and forth, and we'll get things lined up so I can get that bolt in and get it tightened down. Now we can get our flag nut on the back of the bolt and grab our impact and get it tightened down. Now the front end is lifted. All we have to do is move on to the back and do pretty much the same thing, but it's actually a little bit easier back there because we don't have all of the steering stuff to deal with. So let's grab these pull jacks and move on to the rear. So the first step on the back of the Jeep is going to be similar to the front. We're going to get our pull jacks underneath the axle, supporting the weight of the axle, and then go to work removing and loosening everything that we need to get that axle to droop. So with the weight of the axle on the pull jacks, we're going to focus in on this area here. First, removing the lower shock bolt in the back, and that'll give us a little bit of extra room to remove the lower bolt out of the sway bar end link. Just like on the front, we're going to put our factory hardware right back in the shock for safekeeping. Now the shock is out of the way, you can see we have a little bit more room to get on that lower sway bar end link bolt, and we'll remove that next. We're going to finish up on this side by removing this brake line bracket off of the frame and also popping a couple of plastic clips loose on this wire, which is our wheel speed sensor. Again, making sure that nothing's going to get in the way of our axle drooping down. We're also going to remove this plastic clip here on the upper control arm bracket. We just want to give ourselves as much length as we possibly can get on this wire. We don't want to pull it taut while we're drooping the axle down to get the springs out. As we work our way over to the driver's side to do the same thing, we're going to make a stop right here in the middle of the Jeep and remove this bracket for the parking brake cables. Now we can remove the rear track bar bolt. The last thing we should need to disconnect is this breather line from the axle so that doesn't get pulled tight. And now we can start going down on our pull jacks to lower the axle. Now everything should be loosened and disconnected enough that we can lower down on the pull jacks, get the axle low enough that we can pull out those factory springs and get our new ones in. Before we put the rear springs in place, we're going to put our bump stop extensions in, just because it gives us a little bit more room with those springs completely out. And this is the rear bump stop extension. As you can tell, it looks very different from the front one. Instead of going up top here in the bump stop cup or the bump stop tube, it goes on the bottom on the bump stop pad. But the idea is the same. It takes up a little bit of space there. So this has a set of 2 holes in it, as does the pad. You have some hardware. You simply bolt these down into place. This is a locking nut, so you're only going to get a couple turns on it by hand. Before we tighten it down, we'll get the other piece of hardware started. Now we can go back and tighten both of those up. Then we'll install the bump stop extension on the driver's side. Now it's time to put the rear springs in the Jeep, but what you're going to want to do first is grab the isolator from the factory spring. And if you take a look at the isolator, you can see where the tail of the spring sat in there, so it just makes sense to line that up with the tail of the new spring, get that aligned properly, and then put the whole thing up in the Jeep. So we're going to set it up in the Jeep. We're going to put a couple of turns on our pole jack just to put enough tension on the axle so that the spring isn't going to want to fall out again. We'll get the other one installed as well, and then there are some retainers that we'll install to make sure that these springs aren't going to go anywhere. Now we can bolt on our rear spring retainers, and essentially what that is a large flat washer and some hardware, and the washer gets bolted on top of the lowest coil of the spring, and the bolt and the nut pinch the spring down onto the bottom spring perch. That way, if you do fully articulate the rear axle in a way that all of the weight comes off of one of the springs, the spring isn't going to fall out. As the weight comes back onto the spring, everything's going to be lined right up again. So it does come with that hardware. It's also going to come with this tool, and this is really necessary in order to get the nut on the bottom side of that spring perch. The hole's already there, but the way that the perch is welded on top of the axle tube, it's really difficult, if not impossible, to get the nut in there, and even more difficult, again, if not impossible, to hold that nut while you tighten the bolt from the top side. So when you find this in your bag of hardware, that's what it's for. Make sure you hang on to it. It's going to be necessary for this step. So we'll get our washer set in place here, and our bolt and our locking washer set in top of that. And then we'll load the nut into our tool and feed it underneath the spring perch here so that we can get our bolt started into it. And we can grab a 9/16 ratchet and we'll tighten that down. The next step we're going to do is bolting up our sway bar end links, and the reason we're doing that now is because once we have the shocks bolted up, they're in the way of the hardware down here. So while it might seem a little bit out of order, it actually does make sense to do this next. In the back of the Jeep here, you actually get a new longer sway bar end link, so we're not just bolting up the factory ones, we're going to be completely changing out that end link. So if I swing it down to where we can see it here, we're going to be unbolting the sway bar end link from the sway bar itself and bolting the new longer one in place. Now with this being a tie rod end, when you spin this nut, it can spin the whole threaded shaft, and there are two different ways to hold it. One is with an Allen key in the end of the shaft here, and the other is with a 3/4 inch wrench on the other side of the sway bar, and that's what we're going to be using. So we'll get our wrench in there, just like that, and then we can use a socket to remove the nut. This is our new slightly longer sway bar end link, and as you can see, it's a fairly similar setup. The differences are there's no flat spot on the inside here, so we are going to have to use an Allen key in order to hold the shaft from spinning. Before we connect the end link to the axle, we'll go to the other side and swap that end link out. Now that the end link is attached to the sway bar, we can get it repositioned so that we can bolt it to the axle. We're going to be bolting that up with our factory hardware. Now we'll do the same thing for the other side. Next, we're going to bolt up the lower shock mounts on the axle, but in order to do that, we need to raise the axle up by cranking on the pole jacks. Our next step is our rear brake line relocation bracket. So we're going to bolt the bracket to the frame in the factory location with the factory hardware. Then we have some new hardware that will bolt the brake line itself onto our bracket. And the idea here is just to lower things down a little bit so that, again, at full droop, we're not going to end up with any issues of pulling taut any of our brake lines. We'll get that started there. And then again, including the kit here, we have a bolt, a pair of washers, and a nut to bolt the brake line onto the bracket. And we'll tighten all of that up. Then do the same thing over on the other side. With the weight of the axle hanging by the shocks, we can completely remove our pole jacks, and that's going to give us a little bit more room to get on to installing the next part, which is our rear track bar bracket. Then we can put our bracket in place and start bolting it up, and as usual, we're going to leave all of that hardware loose until we get everything started, then we'll go back and tighten it up. And we'll just pull our track bar down out of the way here to give us a little bit of space. So we'll get our bracket sitting in place here where it's going to go. Now we can grab our lower control arm bolt, get that back in place, and then work left to right, putting the factory track bar bolt in, and finally our U-bolt before we get the track bar bolted into our bracket. We'll get that lower control arm bolt back in. If you do have an alignment issue trying to get your control arm bolt back in place, you can jack up on the pinion of the axle a little bit just to roll it, and that might help your alignment just enough to get it in a little easier. we got that started, we are going to leave it a little bit loose until we get the rest of our bolts in place. Now we'll put the hardware included in the kit through our bracket into the factory track bar mount, and we have this large crush sleeve that's going to slide in from the bottom side to make sure that when we tighten this, we don't compress our bracket. After tapping our bolt in place, we'll put the washer and the nut on the back side of it. Now we can put the U-bolt around the axle tube. Secure that with some washers and some nuts. One thing that's important to note is the thread pitch on the U-bolt is different from the bolt we just installed in the factory track bar mounting location. So if you mix up these 3 nuts, you are going to end up with one that doesn't want to thread on, so make sure you keep all of your hardware separated so it's going in the right spots. Now we can get our track bar bolted up in our track bar bracket. Because this is the 2.5-inch lift, we're going to use the lower bolt hole. With all of the hardware started by hand, we'll go back through and tighten it all up. With our track bar bracket all tightened up, we can tie up a couple of additional loose ends. We have to reattach our wheel speed sensor wiring to the frame and to the axle. That way it's not going to get pinched during the axle travel. We'll also reattach our breather line and finally our parking brake bracket. So if you are looking for a well put together and very complete lift kit for your JK, I would recommend taking a look at this choice from Teraflex, and you can find it right here at ExtremeTerrain.com.